This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken kick off today's show with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. This week, the pair converse about ethical and responsible harvest. Keeping today's show moving is Eric Adee, K-State agronomist in charge of the Kansas River Valley and East Central Kansas experiment fields, as he explains research that he has been working on that looks into early planting soybeans. Mike Brouk, K-State dairy specialist, ends the show explaining how dairy farmers can use what's called the heifer completion rate to determine how large their heifer production needs to be every year. That and more is coming up ahead. We start our Tuesday show here on Agriculture Today with part of the Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Today, I think we're going to have maybe a little bit of back and forth. Joe, you wanted to talk about ethical harvest. That's something we've talked about a few times, but maybe have a whole episode where we talk about that. So.
Yeah, we kept threatening it a little bit, teasing it a little bit here and there. And I was out during extended antlerless deer hunting season this year, and I'm sure like a lot of our listeners sitting there, and of course that's when you see the biggest bucks of the season, right?
Yeah.
And so I was sitting there, and this monster buck walked out in the cornfield I was hunting, and it just got me thinking, there's that little angel and devil playing on your shoulders, and of course I would never take that shot, but you start to play through some of those scenarios, and it just got me thinking a little bit about, what is ethical harvest? Why don't we take that shot? Why would it be bad if we did? And then, kind of some of the management scenarios, science behind some of those thinkings as well.
Yeah, well, that's good. I know as I was thinking about all of this and maybe some of the different things I wanted to bring up while we were talking about it, I kept having this little internal battle about, is ethical the right term that we should use for this? Because, all of the different stakeholder groups who are interested in wildlife have different value and belief systems. And so that influences what they may feel is ethical or moral. And so I tend to think about this stuff as maybe responsible harvest rather than ethical harvest because we can maybe be a little bit more objective in what we talk about.
Ethical harvest is a term that social scientists have kind of come up with. That's why I utilize it. I like responsible harvest, though. I think that resonates a little bit better, a little bit more with me personally, too, thinking about, is what I'm doing or the activities that I'm doing responsible for now or future generations, future years of hunting and fishing. So, both of those I think are good terms. But what is ethics? That's part of that discussion. You could say the same thing, I guess, about responsible, right? Does it matter what you think a year or two or tomorrow?
Sure.
Do your thoughts matter at all to being out there? So that's part of the fun of what we're going to talk about today, I think.
Yeah, definitely. When somebody asks me how you go about harvesting in an ethical way, well, my first step is I'm going to follow the regulations, right? And those regulations are set so that harvest can be sustainable. That's an important aspect of those regulations. But sometimes they can still be taken advantage of.
Sure.
Right? And so if we overexploit a local population or a group of quail in a covey, that's an example of how even though we're following the regulations, even though nobody in our party takes more than the limit of quail, if we pursue that covey until they're all gone, then that may not be ethical because we're not leaving any for seed, so to speak, right?
Taking that another step, what if you don't know that taking all of them is a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
And so kind of your understanding of what's going on out there, I think, plays into it as well. So, ignorance is bliss, I guess, to some extent, and that's ignorance is also not an excuse for breaking the law. So still following those regulations are important, but if you're following the law and doing something with negative consequences that you don't necessarily know, that's I don't know. Is that okay or not? That's for different people to kind of figure out. Let's talk about fair chase for a minute, right? I think that's a topic that comes up a lot. And so fair chase to me means giving that animal a fair, reasonable opportunity to escape my activities that day, right? So I don't want to go out and put a lot of sedatives in a pond that's going to make all the fish float to the top. I can go just pile them all up. I want that. Sure. I want to have to use 10 different colors of lures that day to be able to harvest a fish. And some days it's going to work and some days it's not. But I'm interested to see what you think.
I tend to, I don't know. My definition of that sort of thing might be a little broader than some folks. I know that there are groups who think that the only kind of harvest that's okay, and this is probably not thinking about fair chase so much as it is other things, but only subsistence harvest is responsible. There are other folks who think that only traditional methods of pursuing animals are ethical, and so maybe a traditional archery hunter might be the only thing that's ethical. One of the things that always gets to me is hunting with hounds, using dogs to assist humans in hunting is something that's been around for a really, really, really long time. So that's a very traditional form of hunting that some folks don't see as fair chase because the hound is doing the work for you. But there's a whole lot of effort that goes into training that dog, right? You know something about that.
Yeah.
That we've got these knuckleheads that we have to train to do what we want them to do when we go out there. And I think that I draw the line where I'm thinking about technologies that the animal can't escape. So, there is definitely a role for the use of aircraft in certain situations, but, for most species that we're trying to manage sustainably, using aircraft to harvest them is not something that we're going to do from a harvest standpoint.
Sure.
It's allowed for recreational hunting of feral swine. Feral swine are an introduced species that's incredibly damaging to our ecosystems. It's also a tool that's used in wildlife damage management. But I don't see a role for that from a recreational standpoint for most species.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that line can get blurred though, right? So I mean, I would say that aircraft are probably on one extreme, but what about a crossbow during archery season?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's just kind of figuring out. Some people are going to be okay with that, and some people you talk to are going to say that's a firearm. It should only be used during firearm season. So the line is there somewhere. It's just a matter of where that line is. After we do kill an animal or harvest an animal, what that looks like and how does that play into ethical or responsible harvest. So, to me, it's obviously there's some simple things, use the meat off the animal, but where does that blur the lines? What if you're out fur harvesting, right? I mean, again, the legalities maybe is an easy way to kind of cut what is ethical or what's responsible and what's not, but just interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, the way I would think about that is I'm not going to harvest an animal that I don't have a use for.
Yeah.
That's part of the North American model for conservation. If we're going to kill an animal, then there needs to be a legitimate reason for that. If that's a fur-bearing animal, then that means that I need to get that animal home and deal with that animal in a time period where the fur is still going to have value. I try and, like with meat, try and get them processed as quickly as I can so that meat has the best value that it can at the table.
I think we could take it a step beyond just the animals, too. We've talked quite a bit about that. But, to me, ethical or responsible harvest also means treating the environment well, right? And so simple things like cleaning up your trash, taking everything out with you, but also making sure, are we managing some of that habitat the best we can, or are we giving back if we're going out to a public area? Are there little things that we can be doing in each of those areas? So, I just think habitat management, respect for the environment is also an important part of it that might get lost in translation a little bit when we're focusing on the animals. So, taking kids out. So, getting that next group of hunters or fishermen interested in being outdoors, I think is really important too.
Yeah. That's definitely important. Well, kind of along with that, thinking about using humane equipment. So we're not catching critters that we didn't intend to kill, but we're also humanely catching the critters that we do intend to harvest. Or maybe we're using a hunting caliber that's appropriate for the species that we're harvesting. It's not so big that it blows the critter apart and makes it unusable, but it's also large enough and has enough energy to efficiently transfer into that animal to quickly kill it.
Yeah.
And one of the big criticisms of traps and snares by folks who don't necessarily know a lot about them is that they're just across the board inhumane. And you talked a little bit about how much time biologists have put into thinking about regulations and conducting studies to make sure that things are done appropriately. And that's one of the areas that a lot of people don't realize is there's an incredible amount of research done. It's called best management practices for harvest of fur bearers. That's testing traps to make sure that the traps that we're using are humane for the critters that we're catching, and that snares either humanely restrain an animal or very, very quickly kill them so that they're euthanized. They get a good death rather than being tortured and that sort of thing. So I think there's lots of different things that go into ethical harvest or responsible harvest beyond maybe some of the things that just immediately come to mind.
Yeah, and I think beyond just the biologist or the companies making all these things, making sure that you as a hunter or a fisherman are taking the time to understand your equipment and go practice shooting your bow, practice shooting your rifle, understand the hook size and how to properly put bait onto a hook to reduce the ability for it to kill those animals. So all that really goes into it as well.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you'd like to listen to the full episode, you can do so by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about research in early planting soybeans with K-State agronomist in charge of the Kansas River Valley and East Central Kansas experiment fields, Eric Adee. Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Eric, as we're talking about early planting soybeans, what do we mean by early planting?
Okay, well, traditionally, we thought the 1st of May was pretty early. Time we get corn planted, we're thinking about, okay, let's turn to soybeans. So we want to get corn planted, the last week of May or April, and then we start thinking about soybeans. And, some people that are trying to avoid SDS, they may even push that back to the last half of May, which you'll get less SDS that way. But what we're talking about is we're going before corn planting. We're looking at maybe even in the end of March if the soil conditions are good. So when we're looking, what we're talking about in this study is planting starting at the end of March if the soil conditions are fit, and then we're spacing it out, going back. The last planting date we have in this current study is 1st of May, first week of May. So we're pushing it quite a bit earlier than what is traditionally planted here in the Kansas River Valley of Kansas, and so we know where there's some farmers trying this. We're just wanting to see how this affects how soybeans yield and mature.
How long was this study?
This is a 4-year study. We've done it here at the Kansas River Valley. We've also conducted it up at North Central Kansas at Belleville, the North Central field with Scott Dooley. But I'm sharing, here's the data I have here. I've got it ready to present right now. So,
Eric, you mentioned sudden death syndrome, and what did you see as you were planting early and earlier than what's typical in Kansas?
Okay, sudden death is favored by cooler, wetter soils. It's a fungus that lives in the soil, and if a susceptible variety is growing under kind of stressful conditions, you will see more sudden death. It comes in through the roots and will colonize the lower crown of the plant. And it shows up, and it can cause very significant yield losses. I mean, we can have 50% easy in a bad year, maybe even higher than that. So it's something we need to be aware of, and that's why a lot of farmers are gun-shy about planting any earlier. It's because it is a significant disease. But we do have some tools to work with now. We've got varieties. There's nothing totally resistant. We have some that are very much more tolerant, and we also have a couple of seed treatments that are very effective. And so far, they've been very good. really reducing the severity and the risk of sudden death syndrome.
Was that the only factor you were thinking about when you're picking out what varieties to plant with?
Well, we want yield because that's what we sell. Bottom right-hand corner is bushels we sell. But that is one of the factors. There's good agronomics and other good disease packages. So there's other diseases out there. There's some root diseases, Pythium and Phytophthora we need to be aware of. But for the Kansas River Valley especially, the sudden death syndrome is probably very significant yield loss. Cyst nematode resistance has to be in about every variety anywhere soybeans are grown. So that should be in about every variety that's available. But for specifically, if you're going to push things earlier, we know sudden death is going to be worse if you're going to plant earlier into cold, wet soils.
You mentioned cold, and that's something that we see as more possible or favorable as we get earlier and earlier in the year. And did you see any issues with freezing or frost?
We didn't have any death, any soybeans killed or emergence issues, but we took measures. We put on very good seed treatment, and we had good varieties. We did see a very delayed emergence with an early planting date. It may take them 3 weeks. On the average, it's almost 3 weeks for them to emerge. And that's a long time to sit there and wait and see if it's going to actually come up. Normally when we plant them in the middle of May, they may be up in a week. But we took stand issues. We had different populations. We didn't see any stand loss. But if we didn't have those seed treatments on there, it would be a very different picture. We might not have anything come up.
So the crop really is focused towards length of day and not just calendar day?
Yes, but initially at the beginning of the season, it's soil temperature is how the speed of the crop is emerging. So, we're at that early, we may not even be up to 50 degrees. Well, it needs to be about 55 degrees for soybeans to really get their machinery going. So typically we would say the target is 55 degrees. But if you catch some very nice conditions, very good soil temperatures, moisture-wise, it's ideal planting conditions, just the date's not right, well, is planting soybeans an option?
And you have an example of a story of your first year from this when you did the experiment of you planted, they started to emerge, and you got snow. Yeah,
the first year we planted, we hustled around and got them in the ground the last week of March, and they were just starting to crack through. I was kind of watching to see when they had emerged, and we just starting to see them crack through. They weren't out of the ground yet, and the next day we got 4 inches of snow. It was like April 20th. And okay, let's see how many actually survive. Actually, we didn't lose any. So they survived very well. But again, the seed treatment was very key for that.
Did you see any differences when it came to maturity of this plant?
When we plant that early, we will see a few days earlier maturing. On average, compared to the 1st of May planting date, we were about 4 to 5 days earlier. But, we planted like 30, 34 days different, and we ended up maturing only 4 or 5 days different. So the soybeans have a way of compensating. They go off a day length a lot. That's how they respond to the season.
What did your yields look like?
Actually, the best yields we had were with either the first planting date, which is the end of March, or the middle of April planting date. And given year, either one of those were the highest yield, and they averaged about 4 bushel better than the 1st of May planting date. So that's averaged over 4 years in 2 different varieties. We had a 3.7 maturity and a 4.1, 4.2 variety. So there was a yield advantage. I was concerned we might actually have a yield dip because we're so slow coming up, but emerging. But the last planting date, May 1st, first week of May planting date was about 10 to 11 days to come up, where the first planting date was about 21 days to come up.
Did you do this research on irrigated or non-irrigated land?
This was all on irrigated ground in the Kansas River Valley. So moisture wasn't a limiting factor. And some years we had to irrigate quite a bit. And that is a concern. If you're planting in dry land, you may get a bunch of nice foliage and starting to set a bunch of pods, and you run out of moisture in August. And that you're not going to see the added yield. You may not see the added yield benefit. That is, in Kansas, that that could happen. That has happened. So, but under irrigation, moisture isn't a limiting factor. So we can realize that extra yield potential because we got extra pods, we got more beans filling, so we can realize it with the irrigation.
Eric, are there other concerns you heard about when it comes to early planting soybeans?
Primarily, the disease is the main one, sudden death syndrome, frost damage. And actually, when looking at the weather records, most of these, like the end of March planting date, generally they were emerged about around the 20th of April. And there's less than 10% chance that it gets down to 28 degrees there, which they might be susceptible to freezing at that time. Just depends how long duration it's that cold. So it's much less of a chance than I initially thought before I started digging in and seeing when we will get a killing frost. I have seen a killing frost May 2nd and 3rd, but that's not very often. But again, this is Kansas, and we don't know what's going to happen any given year.
What are a few key points you'd like to tell soybean growers as you have done this research?
Okay, if I see early planting date, or much earlier than traditional planting in the first half of April, into March even, if you've got ideal soil conditions and you've got the seed, and you've got the right variety, and you've got a good seed treatment. The seed treatment is very key because there are other things that will kill. You won't even get a good emergence because there's root rotting diseases in those cold, slow growing conditions as they're trying to emerge. These root rotting pathogens will kill them, and you won't have the emergence. So with a good seed treatment and also seed treatment for sudden death syndrome, and a good variety that's the most tolerant one, most resistant one you can get, I think you can realize that there is a good chance for a good yield potential. And it may spread out your planting risk over time. You won't get caught in the middle of May waiting for 3 weeks trying to plant, and it just keeps raining and raining and raining. So I think this is a viable option, especially under irrigation.
Eric, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was K-State agronomist in charge of the Kansas River Valley and East Central Kansas experiment fields, Eric Adee. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk with this week's Milk Lines.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. Demand for dairy heifers has increased over the last several months and is expected to continue. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages dairy farmers to use what's called the heifer completion rate to help determine how large their heifer herd needs to be each year.
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some of the things we're seeing with heifer replacement prices as we move into 2025. Seems as though with a little bit of an increase in the price of milk and a great increase in the demand for dairy heifers, those prices have jumped up in the last few months. There have been reports here early in 2025 of replacement heifers costing between $3,000 and $4,000 apiece. Seems pretty high, and when you consider the prices for cull cows, often between $2,000 and $2,500 apiece for larger cows, it's understandable that heifers might be worth that much. We've also had some reports of wet cows selling for close to $3,000 per head. One of the things that's pushing this is our utilization of beef semen on some of our dairy animals to create the beef by dairy crosses that we're seeing in the feed yards. With today's value of those animals, and again there's been some extreme prices reported there as well, upwards to $1,000 per animal for a calf that's only a few days old. Many of these selling between $600 and $700 currently. So that's putting a pressure on the dairy farmers to keep producing these crossbred calves, which takes away from our heifer supply. So one of the things I want to encourage our dairy farmers is to carefully consider how many heifers they actually need to produce every year to have enough replacements for their herd. And one of the things that is often left out in this discussion is what we call the heifer completion rate. In other words, every heifer that is bred on your farm is not going to make it into your lactating cow herd. First one that takes away from that potential supply is just simply abortions, whether that be early on or at any time during the pregnancy. And, as we look at that, it could be 2 to 3% of our breedings might result in an abortion at some point in stage. Calf death losses. Not every calf born on your farm is going to survive through the first couple of days of life. And oftentimes it could be as high as 2 to 5% on a given dairy. We also are going to lose some of those heifer calves during the initial growing phases as they go to the weaning area, and that could be about 2%. Breeding failures also occur. Not every heifer that is born will actually conceive, and oftentimes we might see 1 to 2% of the animals that do not breed in the window we would like them to breed in. Also, there can be some additional culls due to injury or other things, disposition, whatever might be, and that might be another 1%. So you add all that up, and that could be anywhere from 8 to 13% of your heifers that you had actually planned breeding for. Now, this would be kind of conservative. As we look at herds across the United States, it's not unusual to find herds that actually have a heifer completion rate of 80% and sometimes even less than that. So, how large does your heifer herd need to be? Well, you got to take into consideration the losses that are going to occur in that 2-year period. So, making sure that you have enough extra heifers born and planned for in your breeding program is important. That could be increasing that expectation by 20% to make sure you can cover this, or take a look at the information from your own herd, determine how you actually are doing. Maybe you can get by with 15% extra heifers planned for to cover these losses. Again, you have the data, so take a look at it and determine if there's something you can do to improve your heifer completion rate as you look at the data and try to determine what you actually need to plan for in your breeding program. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to carefully consider the size of their heifer replacement herd, as we will likely see higher prices for heifers in the coming months.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.